So before we get into doing some stuff on movement of water in plants, both transpiration, movement of water up through the roots and out through the leaves, and translocation, moving solutes, dissolved substances, basically this is sucrose around the plant. I think it's worth talking about the mechanisms that we're going to be looking at in both cases here, because they're fundamental to a lot of how organisms will move things around anyway, so I think it's worth mentioning. So this idea of gradients, which you're actually already familiar with, or should be. For example, when we talk about diffusion, we have the idea of a concentration gradient, which is the concentration of chemicals. If you have a higher concentration of chemicals in one place than in another place, they will diffuse. Now, why do they diffuse? Without going too far into the physics of it, I suppose, molecules will try to get to, they call it the lowest energy state, if we're going to be particular. You can think of it simply like molecules are lazy. They want to use the least amount of energy possible, and the least amount of energy possible involves them all being spread out. Okay, a bit like if you think about if you think about a room that gets more and more untidy over time. Why do rooms continually get untidy? Well, you can keep tidy. That takes a bit of effort to keep your room tidy. You've got to put energy in and effort in to keep it that way. Otherwise, it tends to get more and more messy, because that's just what it does. That's I suppose a simplistic way to think of it as a model. So diffusion down a gradient from high to low, we're probably quite familiar with. And of course, the higher we make one end in comparison to the lower end, the faster that rate of diffusion will be. That rate of diffusion will be quicker. Okay, but we can have other types of gradients as well. For example, you can basically call an electrical gradient. Really, this is talking about charge. So if you have lots of charge in one place and not much in another place, it will tend to move down the gradient. Remember that it's worth mentioning here, things will move down gradients. Don't say they move along them. They move down. I know I'm just showing this here sort of high and low. It doesn't have to be high and low. The area could be here. It would still be moving from a high to low. Okay, so it doesn't have to be. I'm just drawing it this way. You can have, let's have green just because, an electrochemical gradient. And these are really important in living systems. An example of that would be hydrogen ions, which you may or may not, depending on where you are in your A levels, have come across this a lot yet. So a hydrogen atom that has lost an electron is a hydrogen ion, or also known as a proton. And because it literally consists of one proton and no electrons. These can move, so if you have lots of protons in one place and not much in another, you will get diffusion down an electrochemical gradient. Why electrochemical? Because the hydrogens are in a high concentration over here, the hydrogen ion if you like, but also there's more charge over in one place. Now this is really important, because when you've got a movement of these things, usually we're talking about the electrochemical stuff, that movement releases energy. You can make use of that energy, and in fact that's what biological systems do. Respiration is very basically that. You move hydrogen ions, protons, to one place, and then you let them move to another place, but you do it through a membrane, and in that membrane there are proteins, and they harness the energies it moves through. So electrochemical gradients, really, really important. Pressure gradients, which we'll be coming across when we talk about transpiration. If you have a high pressure in one place and a lower pressure somewhere else, you get movement. One way you can think about this, these tubes that sometimes are used for various things, called manometers. It's basically a U-shaped tube, and you would put some liquid in. So there's my liquid. Okay, and I don't know, let's say we blew some air into this end, so we increase the pressure of gas at this end. Well, what's the liquid going to do? It's going to move that way. You're moving from a higher pressure here to a lower pressure there, and you might think, well, of course that's what it does. But what it's doing is it's obeying a pressure gradient. It's the higher pressure is moving towards the lower pressure. Okay, you can think of it that way. That will be one of the mechanisms we'll use when we're moving water around. And I suppose you can also talk about thermal gradient. It's not quite the same thing, but you know, something's hot. Where does the heat flow? It flows to a colder area. You think of that as a something that can affect biological systems as well. But that one, we'll be coming across when we look at moving water around in plants. So basically what plants can do, they don't really move water around, you know, they don't pick water up and move it, or they don't move water molecules around, but what they can do is they can move solutes around. And once you can move solutes around, you can move water around, because wherever the solutes go, the water will follow. There's our water. Again, I'm simplifying this, but just as a concept, it's worth thinking of. Of course, we would refer to that as osmosis, water moving toward, there's a more concentrated solution, if you like. But that's really what we're doing. If we've got a mechanism to move solutes around, the water will simply follow it as a passive process. And of course, in biological systems, we know that this requires a partially permeable membrane, or else the solutes would come back through, so only the water can get through. And just using these methods, pressure, diffusion, the electrochemical gradient, we can pretty much move things around. So just briefly to give a couple of examples of where this kind of stuff might happen. If we think about a plant as, you know, if we think about xylem tubes, what's happening in a xylem tube is we're getting water going at the bottom, we're pushing water in, so you know, we're pushing all this water in, we're getting a high pressure here. What happens at the top? Well, the water evaporates. It's going from liquid water into water vapor. There's a lower pressure there, and so this stream is going to get pushed up, partly from the pressure, partly other things, of course, we'll look at. But we've got a high pressure at the bottom and a low pressure at the top. It doesn't matter that I'm drawing it this way. It's going from a high to a low. It's flowing down a high to low pressure gradient. Of course, when you talk about the lungs, you talk about the alveoli, and you talk about partial pressures. What are we doing there? Well, we're either increasing partial pressures, say of oxygen in the alveoli to get it to go into the blood, or we are increasing the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood to get it to go back out into the alveoli, because it's a lower partial pressure. Again, it's a gradient, isn't it? Same thing. And lastly, just to say that wherever we get any of these active processes going on, so this would be happening in the roots, for example, and throughout cells, remember that active transport, which is going against or up a concentration gradient, is going to require energy. That energy is in the form of ATP, which means that anywhere you get an active transport occurring, you're going to get plenty of mitochondria, the organelles, which are the site of aerobic respiration. So that's another thing to always have in your mind, because whenever we've got, you know, most of these mechanisms are actually at some point going to involve some form of active transport. We can always throw this in, and if we want to be particularly clever about it, the phrase that pays, don't ever say that energy is used or made, or whatever you want to say. Always talk about energy released from hydrolysis. There's that. The chemical way to break apart these bonds, hydrolysis of ATP to ADP plus inorganic phosphate. And that's such a useful phrase to have. Energy released from hydrolysis of ATP, or requires energy from the hydrolysis of ATP to ADP, excuse me, plus inorganic phosphate. I should have made that a reversible arrow, really, shouldn't I? But because so many things require ATP, you know, we can always be throwing that in. So we'll now start to look in a bit more detail at the processes of translocation and transpiration.